APUSH History, Lesson 31, The Great Depression. As we had discussed when we left off our last lesson, things that go up must come down. In earlier lessons, we talked about the notion of the cyclical economy, the fact that the economy goes through four phases, being prosperity, recession, depression, recovery. And they kind of go through in a series, almost like a sine wave: good, recession, depression, then recovery, prosperity, recession, depression, and on their way. We're going to look at the key elements today in this lesson that led to the great crash of 1929 and the attempts of the federal government and the American people to deal with this crash. And to start, though, we have to start off with the last tail end of the 1920s being the roar of the roaring 20s. In many ways, the election of 1928 represents the laissez-faire free market state or free market capitalism at high tide. The notion of electing Herbert Hoover president in 1928 seemed like such a logical and obvious thing to do. Hoover had a reputation as a great humanitarian. He was a true self-made man and had been orphaned at a young age, had risen above his station in life, and had been successful at everything he had done in life, his entire life thus far. And there was no reason to think that that was going to be any different once he was president. He seemed like the perfect technocrat, the perfect guy to do this job, who was almost above politics in many ways. What's funny, or actually not funny, but kind of sad and tragic, is that in many ways the very things that make Hoover seem so desirable, the very character traits he had in 1928 that made us want to elect him as a nation, would be the same traits that make him seem so utterly out of touch and despised just 4 short years later in 1932. Hoover wins in a landslide, and Hoover believed passionately in the ideal of rugged individualism, the idea that thrift and self-reliance and effort and hard work were what made America great and what made Americans successful. And so his election was not just it was not a coronation of this idea per se, but it was actually more ambitious than just rugged individualism. There was thought among Hoover himself, he even talked about it in his inaugural address, the day might be in sight when we can banish poverty from the entire nation. So people thought in the spring of 1929 when he was inaugurated after the 1928 election. But as for the Depression itself, all through that summer and all through that year of 1929, the stock market had been fluctuating wildly. And the stock market is where we will begin, although that is not necessarily the ultimate cause of the Great Depression. The stock market's a symptom of it more than anything else. If you want to look at the causes themselves, some of them are a bit deeper rooted in terms of causes of the Great Depression. The first one we will look at concerns the tax policies of Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury throughout this entire period of the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations. Following a policy known as supply-side or trickle-down economics, what Mellon had aggressively pursued throughout the 1920s was a policy by where the rich in corporate America, corporations and the rich, were favored with tax breaks, which produced a widening gap between the rich and everyone else. You began to have an unequal distribution of wealth, which meant that you had an awful lot of money in the hands of a small concentration of the population, and fewer people as a result could purchase goods. So that was going to be one key element of the Great Depression, was going to be the fact that you weren't going to have enough people who were in a position to purchase goods with cash. The cash was concentrated in the upper strata of corporate and individuals, at least in terms of wealthy individuals in the United States. Second of all, with that money out there in the tax breaks, what did the wealthy do with their money to invest to make more money? And even corporations and banks. They invested that money on the stock market. And what happened here is you have what is known then as a bubble in business terms. Bubbles blow up, they get big, and they pop. Stocks began to be valued on the basis of the demand people had for stocks as pieces of paper, not for the actual relative worth or non-worth of the company that was being traded, that was being printed on that sheet of stock paper, that certificate. So the demand was being driven by more demand, as opposed to people buying stock in, say, Ford Motor Company or RCA or something like that of the time period, U.S. Steel, because they thought that that was a good company that was profitable. People were buying stock to chase that stock, to then take it and try to sell it to other people who wanted the stock. So what happened was you had a valuation for stock that was above the actual valuation of what the corporations were worth. So you've got this gap in here on wealth, and that was eventually going to collapse back down, what the market calls a correction, when that bubble burst. In 1929, on October 29th, the famous Black Tuesday, is the day this wave of selling began, when the people on the stock market, the investing community, went from wanting to buy more to wanting to get out and decide that they're going to keep what they had and not risk losing anymore. And the two main emotions of the marketplace when it comes to trading stocks are greed and panic. And you go from greed to panic in about half a second. One moment you want to get more, get more, get more. The next moment, You get cautious, and I want to keep what I have, and so people are trying to sell to liquidate their assets, get their money out of the stock market, and you had an enormous plunge in values and rates during this time, which was reflective of other inconsistencies in the economy as well. The fact that people could buy so much stock was also because they could do what your AP history textbook called buying on margin. In other words, you would buy on credit. You would buy, say, putting 10% of the value of the stock price down. If the stock went up, the additional money that you needed to the additional money that you're buying the stock was taken out of the profits and put into your payments. If the stock went down in value, you had to come up with the difference yourself. And so once stocks all plummeted on Black Tuesday and Black Thursday before that, people were wiped out. They were wiped out on the market, and it did not help that banks, savings and loans institutions, could also trade on the stock market with their depositors' money, which they did. And in many instances, they lost everything after that. Overproduction was a key problem as well. Both farms and factories produced more than could possibly be consumed in the United States. And you had a position with, as we talked about, unequal distribution of wealth. Nobody could buy or pay for goods unless, of course, they were willing to go into debt with credit, which did happen extensively in the 1920s as well, which was going to ultimately hurt many small consumers as well as small investors. The fact that we couldn't buy or sell, other nations couldn't buy or sell to us. We had overproduction, and we also had the highest tariff rates in American history, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is passed under Hoover's presidency. He signs it, in fact, raised tariff rates to about 60%, some of the highest rates they'd been in American history. With this, other nations were simply priced out of the American market. Other nations could not sell goods to us. And if they could not sell goods to us, they couldn't generate the capital necessary to pay back their war debts to the United States. And additionally, in retaliation, European nations and other developed nations raised trade barriers and tariffs against the United States goods in return, which meant that the overseas markets sort of dried up in many ways, and Americans were not buying European goods, Europeans were not buying American goods. You had what was in reference as this stovepiping of the economy. In other words, instead of spreading out trade, you had nations kind of trading just inwardly amongst themselves, not amongst themselves, among their own nation. You had this locking up of the international economy, which is going to damage the ability to create commerce and generate revenue. Overexpansion of credit, I've hinted at, is the installment buying, people buying things on payment plans that they really couldn't afford. Buy now, pay later, which works as long as you've got employment. You lose your jobs, which is going to happen in this downturn. And all of a sudden, you've got this negative suction on the economy. This downward death spiral in the economy begins. The farming section had been weak, as we had said earlier in previous lessons, since the 1920s. With the end of World War I and the major demand for agricultural products, we saw farm prices drop considerably, and the mechanization of farms in America only increased and intensified this problem as more and more goods were produced than could ever possibly be consumed. Lastly, the international finance sector. We've talked about global trade a little bit, but more than that, there was an unhealthy monetary situation that was taking place during this time. As you may recall from your own review courses and previous Get a 5 lessons, in 1919, when World War I ends, Germany is assigned responsibility for the war. The so-called war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles meant that Germany was both assuming responsibility for the war and was going to pay debts, reparations, pay the expenses of all other nations for the war. This wound up being massively unrealistic. And Germany ultimately could not pay these debts. So what the Germans did, instead of defaulting, so you have United States, Great Britain, France, Germany. What the Germans did, since the debt was so enormous and staggering they could not pay it all off, in two separate instances in the 1920s, the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, two plans named after American ministers who were involved, the United States financed part of Germany's war debt. In other words, we loaned the Germans money. All right. The Germans took a sizable portion of this money, not just to stabilize their own governmental affairs and finances, but largely used an awful lot of this money to pay off the war debts, the reparations, if you will, the reparations that they owed to the Allied powers. Mostly they owed to France and Great Britain. They owed some to other people too, but those were the big ones. The French and British, for their part, owed the Americans money. They had accrued a sizable war debt fighting the war they owed the United States. So what they wound up doing then was taking this money, which they wanted so desperately from Germany, and used it to sort of pay off their war debts to the United States. So you can see you've got the equivalent of a financial merry-go-round. Now this works great as long as the primary economy, spinning this merry-go-round, as long as the United States economy is as strong. Once the United States economy ceases to be strong anymore, these payments will cease. And we're going to have a sort of a holiday on these loan payments taking place. When this stops, the whole system falls down. And so you see it's a quite unstable, unhealthy economic situation in terms of having all the money dependent on coming from one creditor just to get that money back to that creditor. So all these things combined, put together, are largely the reasons for the Great Depression. The stock market crash was a symptom. The weakness in the farming sector was a symptom. The inability of foreign trade markets to have adequate credit and commerce was a symptom. But you put them all together and you get the causes of this great economic depression. What were the consequences of this? The consequences were, on your next slide, the awfully grim living that people had to go through in this period. Mass bank failures and closures. Over 2,000 banks closed, and when they closed, because there was no depositors' insurance during this time, banks that speculated in the stock market, if people didn't get to the bank and get their money in time, they received nothing. So people who played by the rules and saved money their entire lives could wind up with none of that money because they had the bad luck to choose a bank that had been reckless or risky. So a total loss of personal savings for many people who are now affected by the Depression who did not themselves make bad decisions. Mass unemployments and layoffs over a multi-year period. The economy was shedding jobs at the rates of hundreds of thousands of jobs monthly in the series of several months after the initial stock market crash of 1929. The steep drop-off in foreign trade, we've already mentioned. We see the economies of the world kind of globally locking up and an inability to engage in any major foreign commerce. Increased tendency and foreclosure for farmers. We'd already seen that farming had difficult times. This only accelerated the eviction of farmers from land and turning them into tenant farmers or simply turning them into landless Americans living a life of poverty. And for all Americans who lived through it, this in many ways, along with the Second World War, which many of them will live through, these will be the defining national events of their lives. It's a reason why for this entire generation, in many ways, they were going to feel the way they were going to feel about thrift, about saving, about the need for governmental involvement in the economy, and about the limits, maybe, of the free market system and the limits of the laissez-faire model.